for being here in a very, very difficult day, a very difficult week, and I think very difficult coming days for us, for everyone in Greece. Before I start anything, I had a planned little intro, but I'll make it shorter, just to say that, of course, our foremost concern at the moment is with the families of the missing people and the victims and the families of the victims, and we're all very, very devastated. We had a long discussion also with TJ and with forensic architecture in relationship to today's event. However, I feel that what happened almost 40 hours now ago is an absolute demonstration of how the necropolitics of this government, but not also this government, many other governments before it, have make all of us disposable. And many times, in the case at least of what we would be showing tonight with forensic architecture, which is a new investigation that the agency has done for Moria. Just one second, Kostalina, are we recording? Great. If you can also use my phone, which is in the bag that my friend has there. Sorry, we're in the DIY. So just to contextualize, Truth Will Not Take Care of Itself is a program that will run for 2 years, and the initial idea for today was that forensic architecture would be revealing their new investigation on the fire in Moria that occurred on the 8th of September 2020. Of course, because of the tragic accident, the train accident in Tempe, we decided with forensic not to go forward with today's opening and to wait a few days and have the opening on Monday. So you're much more than welcome to come and see the investigation on Monday. It will be playing in the screens behind us. Of course, the two very tragic incidents, once the fire and now the train, they are connected. And they are connected because you see on one hand an organized policy, an organized macro policy in that sense, and in the case of Moria, if you will allow me the term, of a parking of humans, closed parking of humans. And then on the other hand, you see a negligence that is very much related to this bare life attitude and thinking that has been going on in Greece more than the last 10 years of the crisis, I would say. In terms of this new program, I would say that many of the theoretical threads that Station of Concept has been looking into these last years kind of tie in, looking and exploring how contemporary cultural practice can position itself in relationship to all these social political questions. But as I said, I'm not going to kind of delve into analyzing that because I think it's much better to allow the space for TJ and also to have enough time for all of us to join the demonstration that will be happening soon. I would, Greek 6 o'clock demonstration starts, it always takes an hour and a half, and with all this traffic happening in Athens, I think we have enough time to have even a Q&A and then all together go to Saint-Germain and protest. Just to give a short introduction on TJ, although I'm pretty sure that it's not necessary very much because a lot of people know of his work and he has inspired also us as well here at State of Concept extensively. TJ is the author of several books, including Beyond the World's End, Arts of the Living at the Crossing by Duke University Press 2020. He's currently in the process of publishing a new book with Steinberg Press, if I'm not mistaken, as as well as against the Anthropocene visual culture and environment today by Sternberg in 2017, Decolonizing Nature, and many other titles. He's a writer, activist, and professor in the Department of History and Art and Visual Culture in the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the founding director of the Center for Creative Ecologies. So I will leave the floor to you, T.J., and then I will hope that we have a lot of questions for you.
All right, thank you. Thanks very much, Ilyana, and the gallery State of Concepts for the invitation to speak. Thanks everyone for coming. I know it's a very hard time. We really weren't sure what to do about this evening, whether to cancel outright or not. I'm not sure what's the best, but we decided to do this, and I'll try to speak about things where I see some relation actually to this kind of condition of disaster that's ongoing. And I speak about this quite a bit in my work in terms of questioning activist and organizing strategies in a relationship to disaster. And there's an old essay that I like to cite in terms of the politics of mourning, which I like a lot and think is very important. It's by Douglas Crimp. It's called Mourning and Militancy, where he's arguing in the context of the disaster of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, that yes, we need to mourn, but we also need militancy. We need to be in touch with our emotions in a way that doesn't take us away from the political, but actually offers an important imperative to become involved in the politics of the larger conditions of disaster. Is the sound all right? Can everyone hear me? Okay. I apologize. I'm a little low energy. I'm fighting a cold or something. So, and I'm speaking about some current research that I'm working on in relationship to Cop City in the United States. I'm not sure if you've heard about this. It's currently ongoing in Atlanta, Georgia, in the States. And yet it connects, I think, very deeply to my ongoing concern for environmental politics, political ecology, and artistic practice, although the artistic practice element will not be so foregrounded this evening. But I want to ask, in some ways, in relationship to my previous and ongoing work, which has really been dedicated to looking at artistic practice and making claims for its political relevance and use value. I want to ask, what is happening today? Why have things not worked out the way that we have wanted to? And why have some of the radical claims made for artistic practices not ultimately worked out? Why have they been inadequate? Why have they failed? Why are we in a state of failure in terms of our inability or incapacity to reverse the conditions of catastrophic capitalist social breakdown? And we see more and more events and extreme violent incidents and tragedies unfolding that signal to us that this is, it continues to go wrong. We're up against seemingly insurmountable forces. So I want to think more about why this is the case. Why what is happening in terms of organizing and activism as well, not just artistic practice. And that has led me to this term, counterinsurgency. So I want to think about counterinsurgency. And to give you a sense of what that is, let me show you this, this video that introduces you to Cop City from an oppositional point of view. So this is part of the video I'm about to show is part of the resistance toward Cop City, but it tells you a little bit about what this is exactly.
For 2 years, we have defended a forest in South Atlanta from those intent on destroying it. This is the Willowney Forest. Those who want to destroy it intend to build a $90 million police training facility, Cop City, with roads to practice high-speed chases and a mock city to practice raids, explosive testing, crowd control, and other tactics of urban warfare. In response, we have protested, petitioned, put our bodies on the line, and put pressure on Cop City construction companies and funders. The climate crisis is already here. All across the world, people are fighting back against the destruction of their land, water, and local ecosystems. The police trained in Cop City will be used to brutally suppress the movements we need to wage these battles now and in the years to come. The struggle for life on Earth and the struggle to prevent the expansion of the police state are one and the same. This is not just a local struggle. With media attention on the rise, city officials are scrambling to control the narrative.
These individuals meant harm to people and to property.
This is a very strong.
Many of them don't even live in Atlanta or in the state of Georgia.
They have fabricated domestic terrorism charges, and they have done this precisely because the movement is strong. The police murder of Ortuquita and the ensuing cover-up could have chilled the movement, but instead it only grown and spread. Together we will stand up for the forest, for the trees and the animals that live in it, and for each other. Wherever you are, we need you here. Come camp with us from March 4th through 11th for a week of action in the Willowney Forest. Cop City will never be built. Willowney Forest is and will always remain a public park.
Yes, so that's a call to action for the continuation of this forest defense and land back movement in Atlanta that will happen in a couple days. This is a war over land between environmentalists and abolitionists and indigenous communities who live in this area on the one hand, and on the other, fossil capital, the police state, and the right-wing establishment on the other. So it's this $94 million project that will come about over the next few years, and it's dedicated to counterinsurgency, in part at the result of the years of struggle under the Black Lives Matter movement in the States and worldwide, which many the political elites and corporate figures and the police in the States view as something that was really destructive and got out of control in dangerous ways. That is the struggle for racial justice in the States. So they're very much thinking about how they can prepare for this in the future through increased militarization of the police, increased forces of repression, new laws and juridico-political resources at their disposal so that they can criminalize protest, transform forest defenders, for instance, into terrorists. They're already using this language in charging forest defenders for what they've done so far in the Willowney Forest in Atlanta, trying to stop Cop City. So maybe the height of the Black Lives Matter protests in the States, one crescendo moment was when activists and people associated with this, with the brutal conditions of racialized policing in the States, actually burned down this police station in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, in the north of the US. This happened in 2020. So in some ways, you can see that this is like they would be pointing to this kind of event to say that we need more forces of law and order. We need more militarized policing. We need more resources in order to stop the conditions of violence coming from protesters. And so they're coming up with an entire array of strategies of what they would like to do. So the movement against Cop City involves all sorts of different things, and it's been going on for a couple of years now. It might remind you of some other struggles because this is happening in many different places around the world. For instance, currently in Lützerath in Germany, there's an attempt to defend a village from being destroyed by an open coal pit mine in the Rhineland. There's of course, the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle a few years ago, which was an indigenous resistance movement. There's another First Nations resistance movement in British Columbia by the Wet'suwet'en people and the Unistoten camp. There's the movement for the protection of the Ogoni people in Nigeria against decades of oil extraction. And maybe this could be related to also the anti-extractivist protest and movement for the environment in Halkidiki in Greece. So there's lots of potential zones of conflict that this resonates with, that pit the forces of fossil capital with anti-systemic resistance. So that resistance comes in numerous forms. It involves intersectionalist community organizing within Atlanta. Here's some of those references. It involves direct action in terms of occupying the forest and trying to stop the movements of development from taking over the forest, including the police from evacuating land defenders. It involves civil disobedience. In the video, it mentioned that during one of these events of civil disobedience, one of the forest defenders was actually shot and killed, Tortuguita. So this is the first time in the States that an environmentalist protester has been killed by the police. This happens in many other places around the world, frequently, especially in places like Latin America. But in the States, it signals a new level of police repression that we're seeing, and we need to be more understanding of this and develop our analyses of this condition. It also involves radical education campaigns. You can find lots of recent discussions online, including at the national level. So when Tortuguita was killed in the forest by the police, this really expanded the movement beyond the local and regional context, and really turned it into a national solidarity movement. So there have been solidarity protests all over the States in recent weeks in relationship to this. There are also social media campaigns and legal challenges and electoral strategies. So how can people who want to stop this development of hyper-militarized policing in this area of Atlanta deploy a diversity of tactics in order to stop it? Even so, though, it has not been successful to date. So this is still moving ahead. There's still these scenes of violent confrontations, where most of the violence is coming from the police. Really, events like this are creating the framework of new debates about what violence is. They're not new. This has been going on for a long time, especially going back to early, for instance, anti-colonial struggles and African-American civil rights struggles in the decades after slavery. But interestingly, these discussions are coming up anew these days, where people who want to stop Cop City are making an argument that what they're doing is not engaging in violence, because when you set a police car on fire, you're not committing violence, you're stopping the violence that the police are enacting. So there's an important distinction here that's political. It's a very, in some ways, difficult, challenging argument to make. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. But I think this is an important new development in recent activism, environmentalism, and defense of land to begin to question and even reject the exclusive prioritization of nonviolence as an activist strategy. All right. So the problem with all of this, including all of what's happening in the defense of the Wollani Forest against Cop City, is that in many ways it all too easily plays into the hands of the police, so that the challenge to the status quo is exactly what Cop City is designed to shut down. So, in other words, the protest against Cop City ends up justifying Cop City. So the more you do to try to oppose this formation, the more you risk providing the police the very justification for further repression. So this is, in some ways, this is exactly what counterinsurgency is. Right? Counterinsurgency is designed to stop any transformation of the status quo. And I wanted to bring this up as well because I think it's unfortunately it's relevant to what's recently happened in Greece. A few weeks ago, there was a massive train derailment in Ohio. In February, and here these are a couple images of what happened. This was a cargo train carrying all these toxic chemicals, including vinyl chloride. It's used in lots of plastic products, and the train derailed and caused this massive explosion. And there were cargo trains still with chemicals in them that were in a very precarious situation after they derailed, and the authorities weren't sure what to do with this situation because it was too dangerous to move. They thought it was too dangerous to move the cargo storage units. So they ended up burning. They just burned the chemicals. And the image on the right is a shot. It's a photograph from someone who was on a plane that happened to witness the toxic plume that resulted from the burning of chemicals from northern Suffolk. So this is one of the biggest train operators in the States, and because of this accident and other accidents like it, lots of people have been looking into northern Suffolk. It's a private train operator, and it turns out that for a long time, for the last couple of decades, they have spent millions of dollars lobbying politicians so that the U.S. state, the government, does not enact regulations on cargo trains, including an emergency brake system that would stop accidents like this from happening. So in other words, this is the not so much an unforeseen accident as an anticipated event that has come about after years of neoliberal deregulation. And that is the result of, specifically, of corporations who are paying politicians to ignore safety protocol and prioritize profits over people's lives and environmental well-being. And so you have an event like this that has just caused an enormous environmental disaster. No one was killed when the train derailed in this case, but it's caused an uncontainable toxic environment in this area, in the air and in the water, as well as the soil. And we're not sure exactly, as far as my research has shown, what the exact implications of this will be. But people are already complaining about not being able to breathe. They've developed what they're calling a chemical bronchitis, a kind of respiratory problem that comes about owing to exposure to toxic atmospheres. And it turns out that Northern Suffolk is one of the main investors in Cop City. So this is a really interesting connection, that there's a financial relation between corporations that are involved in the logistics of the petrochemical industries on the one hand, and on the other, funding increased policing in the states in a larger economic context of growing economic inequality. So it's important, I think, to be able to connect all the dots here and to see that as this disaster that is fossil capitalism continues, it's creating conditions of an increased likelihood of disaster. And the central way that this system is choosing to deal with it is not to prioritize safety, well-being, sustainability, multi-species justice, or any of those things. It's choosing to basically police the crisis, to invoke a term of Stuart Hall that he used decades ago within the British context. To police the crisis means that you attempt to go after and control the symptoms of dysfunction rather than address the causality behind it. So addressing the causality would mean questioning the very existence of capitalism as a framework that can ensure collective safety and environmental well-being. Instead of doing that, maybe this isn't surprising to anyone, it's not surprising to me, it's just like something that I think we have to continue to talk about. Instead of prioritizing safety, it's prioritizing profits. And the way to do that is through policing, which turns any kind of opposition to the status quo, opposition to neoliberal deregulation, opposition to fossil capitalism, opposition to these toxic environments and catastrophic accidents like this, it turns it into criminality. Any opposition to the climate breakdown, any opposition to climate breakdown is turned into criminality. And not just criminality, even terrorism. So again, this isn't something that's altogether new, but the way that environmentalists now in the States are being charged with terrorism for protesting forests, a forest occupation, when they've done nothing that causes harm or violence to people. They may attack property, but arguably that is not the same. That's very different from targeting people. So these forest defenders are being charged with terrorism, which carries potentially decades in jail if this ends up going through. All right. Did I mention this is a work in progress? I'm thinking about all this stuff. I don't have a prepared, really refined argument, but this is what I'm making a provocation and encouraging everyone, I think, to think about this. I'm sorry that forensic architecture and its representatives aren't here.
Actually, Stefanos was, but he was the one with the baby.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah, unfortunately, the event didn't plan as we intended, so I thought there could be stuff here that resonates with forensic architecture and their concerns as well.
I will pretend to be a forensic architecture, like I can
Okay.
infiltrate with the,
Perfect. Okay, so counterinsurgency. So this is just part of the social media campaign. Stop Cop City. This is not just a policing issue.
TJ, just to interrupt for some in the Greek audience that might not know very well the Cop City and the history of Cop City, it would be my first question, but maybe you kind of put it in that it started already vis-a-vis their simulations, etc., kind of.
Yeah, it goes back. It's basically a super funded police training center. But these have existed for a long time, for decades. But this is new. This is a new level at $94 million. It's really, like, the important point is this is a response to the threat that came about through Black Lives Matter protests around 2016 to 20. So it's a new level of counterinsurgent resource building in relationship to that. So that's, while police training is nothing new, this is, I think, signals a new level. So I want to speed up a little bit. So just to read this is not just a policing issue. It's about deforestation, climate, forced displacement and racial dispossession, and state violence, housing and health, surveillance and war, the military-industrial complex, and Palestine, water, resistance, freedoms, and more. Stop Cop City. So you can see that this is part of an enormous entanglement of issues. And the point is that it's all connected. And from an activist political organizing perspective, it's important to think about all those entanglements and connections, as well as the funding networks behind it. So lots of like fossil fuel corporations are funding Cop City. So I'm going to finish up, but just to talk about counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency refers to the totality of actions aimed at defeating irregular forces. It involves media, technology, politics, law, police. In terms of technology and policing, there's all sorts of new protocol and technological forms like surveillance, predictive AI, predictive policing. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but that's basically using computer cybernetic technology to predict in the future where crime is likely to happen, so that police can then preempt that crime. Of course, it carries enormous amounts of bias, and it's a very racialized form of policing, and it basically predicts where policing crime will happen, owing to past patterns of criminality. So it ends up amplifying the very cycle of the disproportionate policing of people of color in the States. So one, to bring it to more of an artistic context, there's a movement in New York City called Strike MoMA, which is an attempt to strike the Museum of Modern Art as a privatized art institution that has all these corporate CEOs on its board of trustees that have relations to the petrochemical industry, media corporations of right-wing newspapers and websites, support for the weapons industry, support for private prisons and police associations. So this is all the Museum of Modern Art. If you look at the Board of Trustees, it's this incredibly right-wing corporate globalization model, including lots of Trump supporters within the Board of Trustees. And they've been really interested in this question of counterinsurgency in relationship to the art world. And I want to think along with them about how counterinsurgency is not just about policing, it's about the totality of actions aimed at defeating irregular forces. So irregular forces is whatever is irregular to the conditions of the normative, which is basically fossil capitalism, if we can put it that way, or racial and colonial capitalism. These conditions are now the norm. So anything that departs from that, or challenges it, or attempts to surge in different directions, this is the target of counterinsurgency. So for Strike MoMA, this is not just a matter of policing, it's also a cultural condition. And along with them, I want to think about how art institutions, even certain forms of aesthetics, can be forces of counterinsurgency, in the sense that they end up reaffirming conditions of the status quo and challenge the growth of irregular forces. These are some of the Board of Trustees members that Strike MoMA is identifying. It's a really interesting and important project. So one thing they bring out in relationship to policing is this notion of reformism. This is from the social media of Decolonize This Place, one of the groups behind Strike MoMA. And they've also been following Cop City very closely. And they write, reformism isn't liberation, it's counterinsurgency. You can't abolish systemic anti-blackness and racial colonial violence by protecting the system itself. And what they're getting into here is how the Black Lives Matter movement ended up making really important calls for defunding the police. It's part of a long abolitionist politics in the States that is targeting the way that the carceral conditions of capitalism exist by warehousing bodies, putting them in cages, and policing communities of color disproportionately. So policing is something that abolitionists want to end and reinvent other models for community safety. The problem is defund the police, and maybe you're familiar with this, was quickly turned into something that was against the movement of abolition. And it became not defund the police, but retrain the police. We need to retrain the police so they don't do things like strangle black people on the streets. Right? We need to provide proper training for the police so that they behave in a way that's legal and helps and improves safety. Of course, this is a massive problem and ultimately a complete counterinsurgent redirection of the abolitionist movement, because it ends up giving even more resources to the police. So it's things like this that has led to Cop City. In other words, the forces of counterinsurgency are appropriating the insurgent demands of decolonial abolitionist anti-capitalist movements to turn it into a politics of policing. We need to fund the police even more. Joe Biden says this, and other people in the Democrats. This is a kind of reformism that for Decolonize This Place is a kind of counterinsurgency. So I want to think along with this, like I said, in terms of what happens with radical insurgent practices, including within the artistic context, when they enter into a certain exhibition framework or meet the neoliberal art institution. And you have a similar kind of logic of insurgency turning into counterinsurgency. This is a complex proposal. It's something that I think Decolonize This Place puts on the table. They don't say this exactly. I'm elaborating on this right now. But what if we think of the cultural economy as counterinsurgency? What does that mean? Well, the cultural economy, it colonizes attention, right? It also it tends to diffuse action into aesthetic experience. It individualizes and makes it hard to collectivize. Not always, like certain exhibition contexts like the last Documenta was very dedicated to collectivization. But nonetheless, the experience of going to the exhibition was very consumerist and very individualizing. It naturalizes art within a commodity form and makes consumerism as the dominant reception of art and cultural experience more broadly. It aestheticizes politics within a liberal economy of criticality. So it even mobilizes criticality and turns it into something that can be consumable. This is something I'm very aware of as a professor at the University of California in Santa Cruz. I'm very aware that when I teach classes and seminars on this kind of material, on political ecology, on anti-capitalism, on movement aesthetics, on forms of resistance, at the same time that I'm doing that, the university as an institution is taking that and turning it into a consumable for students who are paying money to get an education and often going into mass collective debt over this. So it's important, it's crucial for us all to keep thinking about these contradictions and our implicacy within them and how we can necessarily come up with a way of strategic thinking that is ultimately necessarily counterinsurgency. How can we subject the forces of counterinsurgency to greater critical analysis, to become aware of them, so that we can counter them and preempt them in turn. So just some more examples of the transformation of insurgency into counterinsurgency in some ways in that art exhibition. All right, I'm sorry this is going a little bit over. Do we have a little more time? Okay, just really quickly, two more things. Within the environmentalist area of activism and organizing, political organizing, where there's lots of people who are aware that we're fighting for the conditions of livability on the planet as fossil capitalism continues to destroy conditions of our existence, of our collective future, defuturing us all, right? This is something that people, especially within ecology, are very attuned to. There's been some recent discourse about the conditions of the environmental movement to date. One is Andreas Malm's work, which I think is really interesting in his book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, but there's other texts as well. And he says in this book that it's important to recognize that we're losing. I think this is really important. The environmental movement, in other words, after some 3-4 decades of struggle, has not achieved anywhere near the necessary outcomes that it has been struggling for. So the environmental movement is losing, and there's reasons for this according to Andreas Malm. One is that it tends to, for lots of different reasons, fetishize nonviolence as a political strategy. There's other reasons as well, but that's one that he really wants to point to in calling for more aggressive tactics. People have been using aggressive tactics. Like I'm putting up another image here that shows you two Catholic workers in the States who have dedicated themselves to violent resistance, or they wouldn't call it violence because what they're destroying the property like pipelines. They're destroying fossil fuel infrastructure that is itself committing violence. So what they're doing is stopping violence. Of course, the police don't see it that way. They see it as them destroying property, and that is violent for them from their point of view. But they were drilling holes in the pipeline and trying to sabotage the infrastructure of the fossil fuel industry. This is Jessica Resnicek and Ruby Montoya, who you can see pulling off the letters from the Iowa Utilities Board. This is one of the fossil fuel energy companies that was complicit within the development of the Dakota Access Pipeline. So it's really interesting to follow what they have done. And let me just read a couple quotes Ruby Montoya, one of these women here, says, some may see these actions as violent, but be not mistaken. We acted from our hearts and never threatened human life nor personal property. What we did do was fight a private corporation that has run rampantly across our country, seizing land and polluting our nation's water supply. We acted after having exhausted all other avenues of political processes and resistance to this petroleum pipeline that, to my knowledge, is the largest in the United States as far as the capacity that it's able to carry the oil. They're currently in prison for like 10 years as a result of what they did. As you see, they did a press statement and then started pulling the letters off the sign. The police were right there, immediately arrested them. But they believed that it was important to speak out and take responsibility for their sabotage. So that's what they did. Now they're in jail. So this raises a problem for me with Andreas Malm's proposal, how to blow up a pipeline, like when he calls for more direct tactics, which is, again, like at Cop City, the problem is, how does the call for more aggressive tactics not play into the very logic of policing? The policing love, in some ways the police could have written this book. That may be a little harsh, but the police may have written this book to encourage it, like this is perfect from their point of view. They want to be able to respond to this. They want more money and more training and more resources to be able to do so. In some ways, this is a big problem. In other words, there's no theory of counterinsurgency in Malm's text, even though I like it for a lot of other reasons. But I don't see it as an effective strategy going forward, even though I do agree we do need more aggressive tactics. But aggressive tactics without considering the outcomes and the likely police and military response is self-defeating and counterproductive. It's even self-destructive. Another intervention, the second one and final one, and I'll end after this, is this book by Matthew Huber. It's called Climate Change is Class War. And he's arguing, he adds in some ways to Andreas Malm's position in claiming also, in acknowledging that we're losing, the environmental movement is losing, and the way that Huber thinks, the reason why Huber thinks it's losing is because the environmental movement has become largely detached internationally from the labor movement. And it's increasingly become a matter of professional middle class concern. So that concern, because it's professional and middle class, in other words, scientists, NGO figures, activists, professors, journalists, students, because it's been a concern of that class formation, they tend to focus on their own feelings of culpability for the climate disaster. And so there's this development of carbon guilt. There's this sense of a lifestyle politics, like we have to do something about this, we have to degrow, we have to consume less. And this is, according to Huber, coming directly out of a class position. And the problem is when environmentalists call for a degrowth politics, how does that read to working people? It reads as more austerity. It reads to people in the global south as middle-class environmentalists telling them that they can't grow or do what's necessary to survive. So there's a real dilemma here, and it's led to this deadlock within environmental politics, I think in many ways, where we have this familiar dilemma, jobs versus the environment. This is something that Huber is trying to overcome by saying we don't, ultimately, strategically, we don't need a politics of degrowth that continues this failed professional middle class politics. We need a politics of more. We need a politics that will guarantee conditions of collective survival, that will guarantee more access to affordable housing, to renewable energy, to clean infrastructure, to public education, to free healthcare. all of these things that make life worth living for everyone. So that this is a politics of growth, of more, that can help to generate a new kind of widened class composition based within working conditions of working class people, so that the environmental movement can come together with the labor movement. Okay, so then in conclusion, I want to just address some of the questions about truth, because that's part of this new public programming research initiative of state of concept. When I think about truth, it brings to mind some things that Michel Foucault said a while ago about truth. And he considered, I mean, it's very complex, but just to be really, just to distill it very quickly. He said, on the one hand, there's truth as an evidentiary formation, something that's verifiable. Like, is it true? Well, to answer that question methodologically, we can verify it. We can test whether it's true or not. And then truth is always modeled on something that precedes it. Truth is about the faithful reproduction of reality. Versus a completely different understanding of truth, which was one that he very much supported, which was truth as something that creates the conditions of its existence. Truth that's world-building, truth that's constructive, truth that's transformative. And he said a couple quotes. He said, the force of truth that he has in mind is one with the form of the will. So truth and the will come together in building new worlds. And he also said, really in a very provocative way, he said that we can think of how one can fiction a politics not yet in existence on the basis of historical truth. So if the reality as we want it does not exist, then Foucault suggests we can fiction a politics to make it so, right? He's writing this in the early 80s, around 1983. I think this is very suggestive. At the same time, it's impossible to think about this uncritically from today's perspective, because what Foucault is describing, arguably, is exactly what the right-wing media is doing, right? They are fictioning the reality that they want to bring into existence. So the problem with that formulation is it's already in existence, and unfortunately the left has lost that battle. The right has completely become Foucauldians and are very happy and successfully fictioning their reality. So how do we protect against this? How do we develop a theory of counterinsurgency against the fictioning of truth? And my response to that would be to agree with Huber. Can art institutions become caretakers of truth? I think yes, not always, not necessarily, but only if they act as a base of operations in what Huber calls the class war, supporting a working class majority at the service of the needs of the many. So this means thinking a lot more about class. I think it's really crucial because that allows us to have a category of solidarity in which we can actually fight the minority that is the ruling class fossil capitalist power. But this also involves today working within conditions of contradiction and against the aesthetics of counterinsurgency. And by that I'm meaning like reformism, neoliberal policy, the aestheticization of politics, and diversity, equity, inclusion, identitarian politics, or identity politics, I think has become a real challenge. Of course, working class identity is not something that is just readily available. It's itself an internally contradictory site of class struggle. We know that the left has lost working class solidarity in many ways, as they've been abandoned after decades of failed labor strategy. So often we are encountering now the rise of a working class right, a right wing, a reactionary right, and we have this internationally. So that's not something, however, that I think we can accept and give up on. That's exactly the struggle that we need to fight. So how can institutions, in other words, be agents of the formation of a kind of counter fossil capitalist power by basing climate change politics within class war? That's the big question, and I think that's the only way to address the conditions of truth, because truth can be anything that we want. We're increasingly very aware of this. So how can truth build the world that we want, where the we is the majority and firmly based within a working class politics? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wow, TJ. And you said it's not that dense. Wow. So many different breakthroughs.
Wow. Thank you so much for this really inspiring talk. A lot of things that I want to bring in. I think I will start by also expressing my own interest in the idea of COP City. We did discuss it before. I did recently see a documentary about the history of these towns that are basically towns that are simulations of a town where cops and the army, the US Army, are basically since the 60s pretending to have riots. So it's like a whole simulation basically of how to control the crowd. And I'm mentioning it because it starts in a period where the questions that we are discussing today, somehow the roots arrive from there. And I want to specifically mention, of course, civil society and arriving from racism in the US, and the main figure that a lot of people also outside of the US, Martin Luther King, which you also have mentioned in some of your texts, in relationship to violence. And for me, this was quite an interesting point, because of course not a lot of people know the beginnings of the thoughts of Martin Luther King, and he's much more known, globally famous for this kind of peaceful proposition against racism and violence that the African American community had been living with for almost a century. So it's interesting to juxtapose this specific period with today, where of course the Black Lives Matter movement also is tainted in relationship to violence. Self-defense basically is turned into violence, and I think that's where somehow this reformist proposition comes in back then and also here. And maybe, the COP City is literally the architectural construction of that, where that takes place and forms itself also theoretically. So for me, that was one interesting thing, and I wanted to bring also, in case you know for work, Elsa Dorlan, a French theorist that has discussed violence as self-defense and has been, I would say, very heavily attacked in France for this position of hers. But also to bring in Judith Butler's commentary on violence recently, especially after the BLM movement. So I wanted your opinion on that as a first thought, and then I'll have more questions.
Yeah, there's lots there in what you just said. Martin Luther King is a really great example historically of a figure who's subjected to all sorts of, we could say, maybe like historical or epistemic violence in terms of not only his assassination, but being turned into a figure that is largely about today, is understood in relationship to the nonviolent resistance to racism. When if you look back at what he stood for, he was anti-militarism, specifically in relationship to the Vietnam War, but also the militarization of the police. He was against capitalism. He spoke about the tremendous poverty and forms of economic inequality in the States, and of course racial injustice. But those three things, he called them the triplets of evil. So for the mass media and politicians to transform him into what they have, it's basically, this is a kind of case study in counterinsurgency. It's about managing the threat that was Martin Luther King, that would have challenged all of their basic assumptions and framework of existence. So in terms of this issue of violence, there's a really amazing video clip online of Angela Davis when she's being interviewed while she's in prison in the 70s, and someone is asking her about the Black Panthers' relationship to violence. I wish I could play it. You can find it easily if you look this up. It's an absolutely amazing clip where she gets angry at the interviewer, this Swedish journalist who's asking her this question about violence. She's saying, basically, how dare you, accuse us of violence when we have suffered all the things that African Americans have suffered in relationship to slavery, its aftermath, lynchings, racism, police brutality, all of that. And she lists it and defines all of this. So, in other words, yeah, violence is self-defense. There's a distinction also to be made between violence that is against people and violence that is against property that is part of a larger infrastructure that is causing violence. So I think, yes, we have to consider the ethical viability of forms of sabotage and property destruction in order to stop the machinery of fossil capitalism. I think that that's something that needs to be talked about more. I don't ultimately have a well-developed position there, because there's lots to talk about, and I think there's all sorts of potential ramifications that we have to be aware of. And there are groups in the States, for instance, that are calling for violent resistance, like Deep Green Resistance. That's one organization. Mom criticizes them in his book. So it is dangerous territory, and I'm not ultimately sure what the best strategic objective would be. I think it's important to look at cases of like settler colonialism, like Palestine, for instance, and evaluate the degree to which violence as a resistance formation has been successful or counterproductive. I'm not sure. So there's big questions there, and I can't give an easy answer to it. Maybe other people have ideas about it.
I mean, for me, it's more in relationship to the concept of self-defense. So it's not violence that is not provoked, therefore it's violence that is an answer to violence that has already existed. But although you are not unsure, I kind of feel that you did say that it's a draft, what you're presenting, but somehow it feels to me from what I'm hearing that you found a middle ground there between Mon's proposition and let's say a proposition to sabotage SUVs. I don't know if you know about this movement. There was this movement in Sweden where basically destruction of SUVs. There was a manual of how to deflate it. Exactly. I think there is a middle ground there of what type of violence and to whom or to what it is towards, which sounds kind of appealing to me somehow, in the sense that it does not include life, it's not really violence. It's somehow sabotage. I think is a better word and a more interesting word, because it's also linked to military tactics in a way, and this counterinsurgency is also connected to that. But I also wanted to kind of again juxtapose the two periods, like the 60s and today, to bring in another question that we're trying to pose with this program that is related to technology, specifically surveillance technology that you also mentioned, or what many have called algorithmic violence, and how it makes it so much more difficult, first of all, to even consider, I will say in quotation marks, an objective truth, but also to be able to have an effective counter-insurgency tactic. You know, we talked about it a few days ago. I said I start from defeat, and this is my position. I begin from defeat. And one of the reasons why we started this program was also a little bit the desperation. But I wanted your thoughts on that in relationship to how much more difficult, or maybe possibly easy, because if we can take the example of forensic architecture, there is a lot of use of technology and surveillance technology, satellite technology, etc., that they have used in many of their investigations. Therefore, you can have this counter-insurgency.
Well, one thing that's different today than from the 60s is the new levels of threat that technology poses as a form of surveillance. Like as you've seen in Greece with the infiltration of telecommunications and the internet, to the point where we can't be assured of safety and privacy in terms of our communications. So what does that mean in terms of activists and organizing, strategy and planning? It's a real concern when you're in an organization and developing an approach to some upcoming event, and you know, if it's something that's threatening, you can almost assume that the police are monitoring your mobile phones. Like, what do you do in that situation? I'm not sure. Yeah, but it's something that we have to take really seriously and think about. In terms of AI is a really also a difficult subject, and again, it's like I think about it in the same way that I think about art institutions. Like, it depends on what, where's their funding coming from, what are their interests, what are they doing politically, how do they relate to the larger struggle against the ruling class of fossil capitalism. Is AI typically in the service of that framework, of the dominant conditions of the ruling class? I think generally it is. It's developed by them, those who have resources, and it tends to serve their interests. So that the question is, how can we come up with a counter AI, or what some are calling an anti-fascist AI. And the way they define an anti-fascist AI is an AI that is ultimately transparent and at the service of people, of communities that are engaging in that kind of, say, class war struggle, not in the service of billionaires and ruling class interests. So in my new book, I deal a little bit with techno-libertarianism and utopian futurism. People like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos and the control of massive corporations that are using robotics and AI in all sorts of ways that are anti-worker, anti-union, involved in union busting, surveillance as well. They have made it so that if workers on the job are using their mobile phones and entering words like union or organizing, that gets flagged to the corporation, so that there's internal corporate surveillance of workers that's happening. So how can we cultivate and mobilize an anti-fascist AI or a counter AI, I think is a really important question. I'm also aware that there are some out there who are questioning technology on a much larger scale and level.
That's my next question.
Like Jonathan Crary, I've recently read his book called Scorched Earth, where he's arguing any future beyond capitalism will necessarily be a post-internet future. He's thinking about this not only in terms of the carbon footprint of technology, its basis within fossil fuel capitalism and that kind of energy, and green capitalism will not be any answer to that because it's still part of an extractivist paradigm. We've seen that in places like Bolivia and Ecuador, right? The demand for lithium is something that continues the logic of colonialism in many ways. So how do we deal with those conditions, as well as the kind of atomizing, antisocial effects of the internet and social media? For Crary, he mentions this. It's not just about the carbon footprint of technology. It's also about the depoliticizing, alienating social effects of the internet, of social media, and everything. It's the attention economy of the hyper-visibility of the spectacle that phones and mobile phone imagery and Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and all those platform capitalist formations encourage, right? It's all. So he has a really strong position in terms of being against the telecommunications industry at large.
Maybe just to provoke here, so because you mentioned at the latter part of your talk that we shouldn't be discussing the concept of degrowth, but somehow this kind of positioning against technology kind of presupposes degrowth. And just to make it a little bit more popular, there is a series that I recently saw called Station 11, where it's a kind of a post-apocalyptic sci-fi, eco-fi, I don't know how you want to call it, where because of changes of temperature and what have you, you do not have mobile phones, you don't have anything, and you see the remaining survivors trying to basically, I don't know if any of you has seen the series, everything is analog, and they just write things and they use pigeons and things like that. So it's a little bit of a contradiction there that's to think about. Like, yes, on the one hand, maybe degrowth has very much kind of a liberal patina to it, but then on the other hand, or also very much kind of points the finger to our own responsibility and not kind of fossil fuel industry. But then on the other hand, an anti-technology proposition, whether we agree with it or not, kind of demands for a substantial slowing down. I don't know what your thoughts on that.
That's very much part of the ongoing debate these days, between like degrowth on the one hand and what's called eco-modernism on the other hand. In other words, that position is that we don't need to degrow so much as we need to selectively, smartly grow, which means not taking on an anti-technology or Luddite position, a neo-Luddite position just against all technology, but actually mobilizing technology for our own interests and purposes. So that is, there's lots of complexity within that spectrum, and I don't see them as necessarily always opposable, as if they can't connect in some ways. And I'm also aware that a position like the one I just mentioned, Crary's Scorched Earth, this book Scorched Earth that just came out last year, I think he's very skeptical about any possibility that an eco-modernist future is ultimately environmentally viable. It's just like, he doesn't believe that it's possible. You can't have 7, 8, 9, 10 billion people on the planet that is utilizing technology in the way that we do today in an equitable fashion where everyone has access. Where is the energy going to come from ultimately? He's suggested this is not possible. For me, I'm not sure about that. it requires more thinking and discussion and research. There's also the question of what does it mean for someone of his generation, he's like maybe 10 years older than me, who's arguing really forcefully against technology when younger generations are so immersed and reliant on it, including for political purposes. And it's not all political purposes that get depoliticized by the use of technology.
No.
So, for instance, in my organization in the States, in DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, we heavily rely on like signal and internet technology, for better or for worse, but it's there. So just as a strategic proposal, in some ways it doesn't get us very far to propose to younger generations that they should just give up on technology and organize otherwise. I don't know if that's possible. I don't even know what the strategic scenario would be into the near future, where that would get us and how.
But it's also, we can say, again, the other side of the coin is that, of course, this proposition of anti-technology can also be very much kind of a liberal luxury, where you see the CEO that goes without his internet and without his mobile smartphone or whatever for 3 weeks, or does not have a smartphone out of a position. So it becomes kind of a lifestyle and aesthetics, etc., without having really a politicized opinion behind it. But before I open it up to the audience, I just wanted to kind of bring it, of course, back to the culture. I was quite interested in the fact that you brought in Documento 15 as a proposition, because I personally felt that the curatorial team and the proposition, or let's say the cultural, the artistic proposition of Documento 15 somehow was the body where these racial and colonial violences kind of were reappeared, and the whole shebang with the curatorial team, and the fact that a lot of, let's say, the establishment of the art world, of the commercial art world, of a more neoliberal art world that is connected to the market and commercial galleries, even refused to attend, and publicly in articles in newspapers said so. For me, it was so much kind of painting this picture of two different art worlds. One that is very much closely supporting this, the boards that are connected with fossil fuel, and then another one that is really proposing at least this counter insurgency that you're discussing about. It was very disheartening to see the crushing of that. I would say with very old-fashioned propaganda tactics that kind of remind me of different times. So I wanted your thoughts on that on one hand, and then just to put a last question to that as a leading tail to it. Why is it wrong necessarily, or is it wrong, or is it not wrong, to have this aestheticized, I think you said it, you said this cultural economy that diffuses action into experience. I loved this sentence. But even so, if it is that type of proposition that we saw with Documento 15, isn't that even like one step, starting from the defeat?
It could be. It depends. It could also be a step toward feeling satisfied that there are people out there engaging in social, political forms of politics and movement building. So, I want to support the movement that artists like that are taking and dedicating themselves to. And they were pretty, they came into Documento with pretty clear objectives of trying to address the conditions of, and they use the language of healing. They wanted to heal today's injuries that are coming out of colonialism and capitalism. They were pretty articulate about that. And this is like the kind of art that I've been really interested in and supported for a few decades now. And and written about and tried to amplify, tried to contribute to it by giving it more theoretical, historical substance, teaching, talking about it, all of that. So it's something that I feel invested in and in solidarity with. But also, I think it's important, like for myself, to like think transversally. So I'm not just within a seminar context thinking academically. I'm also involved in like movement organizing and acting politically outside of the artistic context and outside of the academy. And I think it's very useful to bring the two together to learn about the weaknesses and the advantages of both, and be more comprehensive in how we're acting. So if Documenta and the curators and artists are dedicating themselves to healing injury that results from colonial capitalism, and they're taking on, in a way, an activist trajectory in their work, then let's evaluate it from the perspective as activists and as organizers. Like, why not then go further? Why not think more strategically? Why not move beyond the kind of rhetoric and approach that they were using, like basically establishing friendships, hanging out, informal sociability, all that kind of stuff, and subject that to some more like activist scrutiny. Like, how can we think more strategically if we're really attempting to challenge conditions of racial and colonial capitalism? And along these lines, I think the use of the word healing, that really like bugs me when that term comes up. I do think it's necessary to heal. We have to heal ourselves continually, but it's always within conditions of ongoing violence. And if you don't mention the conditions of ongoing violence, then the language of healing is itself violent, I find. Right? So to leave it just as that, it participates within this kind of utopian avant-gardism in a way. So I wanna be critical, not to negate Ruan Grupo or the many artistic collectives that were involved in the document. I don't want to negate them. I want to be critical in an active, like affirmative solidarity with them. Like, let's think more about this. To go back to Malm and Huber, we're losing. I think you could say the same thing about the cultural sphere and the art world. Like, those of us who have political ambitions, we're losing within that area as well. Like, we're seeing, and in some ways, Documenta was an example of that defeat in terms of what happened, the exceptionalist German position in relationship to defeating anything that is anti-imperialist by relegating it to anti-Semitism. That whole logic. I mean, this is, in a way, it's necessary to think more about this, and to think again about, well, if there's something that is institutionalized that can be likened to counterinsurgency, maybe that's what's happening. Maybe that explains my feelings of immense frustration when I went to Documenta and saw the possibilities of collective struggle, but their consignment to artworks within that exhibition. I found that incredibly frustrating.
Just to put a little asterisk also that the proposition itself, although it was kind of, I will say, very simplistically beautified in some ways, and just becoming an aesthetic proposition, just to think and not to act on. But what I found interesting was also, and what you discussed as well, that there was the composition of, or the proposition of the audience to think about class, because the whole idea of this rice patty where we're sharing food together proposed that very subtly, and one had to think about it. It was not in your face, but for me that was what that was another interesting thing. I'm going to open up now to any questions from the audience, because I probably have more if you don't. Yes, Nadia.
Thanks a lot, both of you. I I'm thinking so much through your books, actually, DJ, on all these questions, and I want to put forward 3 different things. Probably the one being the very use of the word and the thinking along the lines of strategy may be somehow wrong for what we are going through. For example, why not think in the lines of tactics? Tactics are more adaptive to situations and circumstances, so maybe one fault in the way we're thinking and reacting is thinking too big, too confined in certain streets, whereas insurgency itself is a tactic instead of a strategy. So if we think along tactics, then we question the big turns and moves that we do instead of being more open to nuances. For example, let's take violence or non-violence. Is it something that you can really contain? Aggressive strategies or more aggressive strategies? In May 5, 2010, in Greece, in a demonstration against the memorandum, there was a Molotov bomb that fell into a bag and burned 3 people, one of them a pregnant woman. There was never an outcry from the cultural, the left, I mean the progressive people, against this kind of violence that may have resulted from a strike, very well, intended and very rightful and everything, but yet it was not contained in the way we would like it to be contained. Actually, the only person that started a book writing about it was one of the oldest and well-known Greek anarchists, Theodoros. He wrote together with other intellectuals of the non-partisan, the parties and all of that, a book about that. Where is this, and I'm very much pro-sustainable destruction. Yes, sabotage is a very good book. And actually, maybe even entities that have already had an experience in this, like Greenpeace, we do not agree with it all the time, right? But they know of sabotage, and they have helped smaller communities in Greece, specifically, to do sabotage in Epirus, for example. But there, it is definitely a very important question, this question of violence and sabotage and the victims from all sides, so that we don't have additional policing, as you very well said. Also, going to class struggle, we had this discussion, you and I, the other day, about who is the working class these days. One of the last communist parties in the world is the Greek Communist Party. It is the party that is most supportive of fossil fuel industry in Greece. The most supportive, with no alternative proposition whatsoever. They stop at the fact that the people that are going to lose their jobs, they have to not lose their jobs, but nothing beyond that. No proposal, nothing. They are also most of the people who are now today, already as I was coming by with a car, protesting because they're very well organized. So they can form a basic body of protest. But beyond this, they're closed. So we have so many, in terms of class struggle, there's so many nuances that, for example, middle class, younger scientists, artists, activists in Greece are very much aware of the nuances of what I would call outer growth. The growth is not growing, it's growing differently, as you very well said, growing in some, doing it differently in other ways, doing it in a circular way. It's a form of justice. It's not a form of letting go. or internet-based technologies. In Greece, this is a reason why many people's lives are saved in the islands, because this is the only way that they can be treated by doctors. So there's not an easy answer in all of this. And I'm thinking that maybe by pulling questions from different contexts to different contexts without being very much aware of the nuances in each part, it's wrong. It's a wrong strategy. So to conclude, maybe what art institutions could do is in every case be very much aware of these nuances and bring them forward. For example, Greece, LFC's cultural capital of Europe, I'm saying it as it is, they are getting funded by the fossil fuel industry. We haven't seen it anywhere being written, mentioned, or even discussed. Why? Because most of the Greek artists are already working there, are already participating. You know why? Because they hate this coming together on the terms of art and activism. So what do we do to make them see how this may come together without being, the one forcing or manipulating the other?
I was going to say, let's have the Greek art community first come to the stage, or even doing aestheticized propositions and not actions first, and then I'll be happy for the next step.
So there's a different timeline.
It's a joke, but you're very, very right. And not only that, I found it quite problematic a little bit that you have exhibitions now at the power factories, etc., without discussing what that means in relationship to privatization and a lot of other things. But I'll leave it to you. It was just a mini comment.
There's a lot to respond to. But one of your questions was, what if we do this, or how can we actually bring about change that actually is effective and works? And I've been thinking about that too. And from my understanding, how do you get people who are in charge of funding to change their views? And I think there's one way that has worked historically, and that's through the strike. But not a climate strike, which takes place by just activists on the street, detached from the workforce that will shut down the place of operations, but through a labor, in the classic labor strike. So this is what Huber is arguing as well, in terms of developing the tactics that will lead to the ultimate strategy of an anti-systemic, intersectionalist transformation of the conditions of racial and colonial capitalism. The only thing that has worked historically and will work, I think, in the future is not, at least this is what I've learned in my lifetime, is not mass protests or politics of ideas or trying to convince someone of something or making a better artwork to do that, but actual, like forcing decisions through withdrawing labor. I think this is where we've seen some success today and in the recent past in terms of bringing about real structural transformation and the redistribution of resources. It hasn't gone far enough, and certainly I acknowledge that the left and its organizing capacity is at a historic low, and I wouldn't say that working class identity is something that's ready-made or that is unproblematic or can't be also reactionary. And I'm not saying the Communist Party might also not have problems, like any organization, it can as well. But the fact is, if we're thinking about worker material interests, in many ways, fossil fuel economy offers better conditions of survival, even at the lower levels of income, than anything else. So this has come up recently in California, for instance. people who work within the fossil fuel industry are unionized typically, and they make a decent salary. Within the renewable emerging energy economy of startups, they're typically not unionized, and they pay like 25% less. So if you're making a pitch as an environmentalist to a worker, why are you participating in the fossil fuel industry? Well, for them, from their perspective, it's a matter of, direct material conditions, material interests. So I think that's where the conversation has to begin. That's why it has to be a politics that offers them a better world, not a lower salary, a better world comprehensively in all the different ways that we can imagine it. And to develop that kind of consciousness and that kind of solidarity is the only way, I think, I would wager this, it's the only way that we will see substantial change. And that means through withdrawing labor on a large scale level and shutting down the conditions of fossil capitalism in that way. So that's what I'm increasingly dedicated to and thinking about. It's not at all going to be easy, it's an uphill battle, but I think here I'm just invoking people like Malm and Huber again, just to acknowledge that we're losing. So what we've been doing, arguably, has had very little effect. It's clearly, in some ways, the temptation to continue the same thing again and again is itself a dangerous proposal.
Just to say that, for instance, I completely agree, because just to think of make Amazon pay, for example, or no Amazon Friday or no Amazon today, what was the other campaign, they have had an effect that kind of spilled over from the Western world as well, that is, let's say, the one that is to be blamed more for pollution, bears the brunt of polluting more, to also other locations and other continents. And I also felt that was very, very potent. But to bring it to Athens and to Athens today, we would never have expected, and to the cultural context, we would never have expected that the theatre world in Greece would be going out on the streets and striking from something that is not, you're removing the bodies from the cultural space, from the theatre, from the stage. It's not something that, like you don't have food to eat. It's not that type of a necessity. But symbolically, it kind of has an effect, I think, and it has been proven, because at this very moment they're kind of leading all the discussions that are related to how to go against this disaster capitalist government, is the only way to describe them. Although it is not an environmental struggle in that sense, it's all connected, exactly. So there is no social justice if you don't have environmental justice, and vice versa. But I also wanted to bring again the class thing here, because also in relationship not only to the Greek art scene or cultural scene, but generally, many times you have to have the luxury to be able to take the risk of not working for the fuel industry, of not working for the museum that works with the fuel or is funded by the fuel industry. And personally, my personal opinion, although I'm extremely critical and publicly and through my text, is to also take into consideration the fact that there are, especially when it comes to the working class, there is no luxury of not having salary many times, and this is something that needs to be respected as well. And I think that we really need to highlight what you were describing, that of course if I'm unionized and I have a very good salary, I might also not be interested. And to put it a little bit in a larger context, I just want to also leave this kind of liberal way of thinking about environmental catastrophe of it's our fault and we need to recycle more and we shouldn't take the plane, and our carbon footprint should, not that we shouldn't be doing all these things, sure, but then we should also be looking at very big decisions that are being made that have nothing to do with whether a worker will be working for Shell or not.
The issue of risk that you mentioned is important in terms of what does it mean for someone to go on strike. It means risking, they might not have a salary, they'll be vulnerable. And that's where solidarity becomes really important. So I have a chapter in my new book where I'm trying to investigate this term solidarity. It's not one that's very common within the cultural sector, because the cultural sector and the art world is so has been just dominated by individualism,
By design.
competitive individualism, yeah, by design. So solidarity, though, this is a form of relationality. At least this is how I'm theorizing it. That enables us to resist the privatization of risk, so that we're meant to assume risk as an individual vulnerability, a threat to us individually, and that's the most fearful situation when you realize that you have no one else to count on. If you go on strike, you lose everything, right? You have no support system. So solidarity means socializing risk and developing collectivization that can provide that support structure for people to be able to take on the conditions of sacrifice because it's within a commonality. So I think that is really crucial, and that offers the necessary step forward so that we can actually create the conditions where people who are working in the fossil fuel industry are not threatened with being defutured by environmentalism, but where environmentalists who are aware and concerned with social justice are fighting for their future because it's the future of all. Right? That's the solidarity that I think we need, that will bring the environmental movement together with the labor movement. This is like really crucial. We're obviously at a very low point in being able to do that, but increasingly, it seems like more and more people are aware of this challenge and trying to address it and work toward it.
I think it's a great way to end, unless there is another question. Is there another question? Yes, please.
I don't really have a question, more than various comments. I think I did come a bit late because of the conditions of riots and was raining heavily. But in the part that I came, there were a lot already said by you, thank you, and a lot already on the table, but also in Vienna, which are all valid, I think. But a couple of things that I was interested in is in the notion of degrowth, because it's something that we speak a lot about these days, and I was interested in the counter proposition that you laid out. But I feel closer to what was said before. I do understand, and I do feel the point of the global south to have more resources. They do have resources, but they need to have more of the result of their resources. So from what I understand, from my point of view, the proposition of degrowth is not a proposition of not having anything. The sustainability proposition is about becoming sustainable and sharing the sustainable. That would mean that we would share the overvalue with the South, the global South. So I still do think we do have a need for the degrowth, but to understand it in a different way. It doesn't mean that we will not have anything. It will mean that we will manage our sustainability in such a way that the people who have less, they will have more. And that's the growth for them.
Yeah.
This is what I think.
Yeah. Someone like Matt Huber is coming from the perspective that he believes that it's absolutely necessary to build a movement so that it expands into the lives of working people. And for them who are immersed within impoverished conditions and austerity, the language of degrowth just makes no sense. It's a dead end. It's problematic. It's even offensive. So it's in terms of the language that we use. For some people, degrowth will be the important language. For others, it's really about growth for a better life, for better conditions, right?
I so do understand. I happen to come from Albania and I'm a migrant in Greece, and I do understand that when we speak here about degrowth, when I go back to Albania speaking to them about degrowth, it doesn't make any sense, and it is in fact offensive about it. But I think it's because we have adopted a lot of capitalist language in this way.
Exactly.
And because they look into what capitalist ideal world is about growth, and because growth is so much into what the politicians and high finance language is brought about from mainstream politicians. So this is what they understand. They equalize growth with having a good quality of life. This is because this is what this is what we would understand before thinking about degrowth. What I'm proposing is deconstructing what growth means and putting forward what degrowth might mean. It means exactly sharing and redistributing wealth and having them enjoy the result of their own resources. Because now, because of growth, we are enjoying the result of their resources. We are exploiting their resources. So degrowth for them would mean that they would enjoy the result.
We have to decolonize the terms.
What they mean.
The terms have been colonized. They have been taken over by capitalism.
Maybe before you answer, can we have one last comment?
I agree with that, but yeah, another question.
I'm just building on what's been said, and maybe to bring it back to this question of the environment and the question of nature in Greece, because what we've seen in parallel to the augmentation of the police state is also at the same time the reversal of all kinds of environmental laws over the past years. So this has, been a trend of going up and going down. And what to me has been particularly interesting, and I'll add another term in the mix, the one of progress. And what's been really fascinating, I'm an art economic historian also, is that the same kind of rhetoric of nature, resources, extraction that's been used in Greece from the 19th century on is exactly the same terms that are being used now for the privatization of, and I hate the term resources because it means that it's something for us to take. But, for lack of a better word, springs or forests or anything that's out there under the guise of progress, alongside with growth. And it just goes back to the same ideology that we saw in 1880 or 1890 in Greece. So it's an amazing historical kind of circular comeback.
I wouldn't say only in Greece.
But we have to take back the words. The words have been colonized. So
For me, I think about how we can connect elements of degrowth with another kind of discourse that emphasizes socialist abundance, right? That would be something that connects elements of both of these. But there's a big debate that's going on these days about, as I mentioned, between degrowth approaches and eco-modernist ones. If you look in the pages of New Left Review, there's some really interesting back and forths about this. And yeah, I think often there's terminological understandings, but there's also some important political differences, and then we would have to get very specific, and it would depend on the position of the writer or the thinker that we're talking about, whether it's a problematic, privileged approach to degrowth that doesn't take into account conditions of austerity and global south forms of equity, compared to others that do that, but that tend to have a more complex and viable theory of degrowth that is more about smart growth than degrowth, or selective degrowth and smart growth. But I think, yeah, the term socialist abundance is really good, because that ultimately what we want to get at is a world that will be better and more flourishing for everyone, and not just humans, but the more than human world as well. Right? How can we contribute and cultivate that condition of a flourishing eco-socialist futurity?
I'm not going to ruin it now. I'm just let it end here. Thank you so much, TJ. It was really, really food for thought. And thank you everyone for coming today to mourn actively, I would say, by thinking. And hope to see you again soon here. Thanks.